And I'm Clayton Hunt. With us today is Michael Kennedy. Michael is the founder and host of Talk Python to Me, a weekly podcast about Python and related software developer topics. He is an entrepreneur, a father of 3 girls, a husband, a student, and a teacher. Welcome, Michael. You're absolutely welcome. So, why don't you tell our listeners how you got started in the industry?
So much fun and working it, then I realized there are parts where it wasn't so fun, then it was really fun again, and the parts that weren't so fun were the math parts. I was like, "Uh-oh, that's weird." The parts I'm supposed to be working on are not the fun parts, but the programming parts are awesome, and that's when I kinda knew I probably should pay more attention to this programming stuff because I just loved it, even though I didn't, start down that path thinking I would actually go that way.
Awesome. So, what are you working on these days?
These days, I'm running an online business inspiring and teaching people Python. That means sort of a spectrum of things. So I have 2 podcasts that I run. You mentioned Talk Python to Me. I have another one called Python Bytes, which is like an audio newsletter weekly thing, but with analysis. And then a bunch of courses over at Talk Python Training. And so my mission is to tell the stories of software developers, mostly focused in the Python world, but branched out a little bit. And then for people who are super inspired, if they want to actually learn how to do some stuff, I have some courses for them as well. And I'm trying to just continue to round that out and bring more people into my mission, working with other authors, writing courses, inspiring people to be guests on the podcast, things like that.
Yeah, it seems like Python is having a resurgence these days, and a lot more developers are uh, either rediscovering Python or renewing their love for Python, or finding it for the first time.
Yeah, it's a little unexpected. It's taken a lot of analysis and thinking about it for me to kind of understand why that is. I think I know now why it is. I'm not sure anyone conclusively knows for sure, but Python's interesting. It's been around for quite some time, right? It was released in 1991. It had been worked on, in 1989. I think Guido von Rossum started working on it. So it's not like this brand new language. It's not like Go or Rust or something like that, and it just burst on the scene and took off, or like Swift potentially. But it had been around for a long time and it had been like medium grade popular until 2010 or so, and it just started to just take off. And now, if you look at Stack Overflow trends, it's by far the number one language, and it's one of the few languages with a very strong upward positive derivative rather than sort of trending down as more languages come in. I don't know that downward trend necessarily means the language is actually losing popularity, but there just could be more other to share its space with. But certainly Python is going up. And I have some interesting theories if you want to go into it about why that is. But
Yeah,
yeah.
please.
All right. So I've done a lot of different languages. I've done C, C++. Like I said in my OpenGL example, that's just like terminal compiling, GCC doing OpenGL. Like that's a hardcore bit of programming that I was happy to stop doing when I could. I've done a lot of C Sharp. I've done JavaScript. I've done a little bit of Visual Basic. I've done a lot of Python. So I've seen these different languages. I've looked at Java, but decided not to go there. And one of the things I think is super unique about Python is that you can be very productive and effective with Python with a quite partial understanding of programming at all, and Python itself. So what I mean by that, like imagine I'm a biologist, right? And I've got a bunch of data I need to load up and process. And maybe I was using MATLAB or Excel or something that wasn't quite doing it. I thought, well, let me try this Python thing. I heard there's like 250,000 libraries that let me just pull in stuff to understand genomics or graphs or whatever. right? So that biologist, she might write 5 lines of code, load, pandas, read CSV, do this other thing, pass it over to this, and run that and come up with a really cool result. And that might not have a single function in it, no class definitions. I mean, consume them potentially, but not really thinking about like, oh, I wrote this set of interfaces, and it maps over there, and here's how I test it, and then this is the abstract way in which we might override the algorithm. It's like there's not even a function. There's no compiling. You just run it, and out comes something awesome. And there's other languages like that that are simple. But the unique thing about Python is it allows you to grow into much higher order things. Things like C# and C++ have like generators for each foreign loops, all those ideas of like object-oriented programming, but you don't have to know or care about them until you're ready. And so a lot of people who are getting into programming, they're like, well, how do I get in? Like, what is the simplest way? I probably heard this Python stuff's easy. Let me try that. And they get a little bit pulled into it. Then they're like, oh, I want to do a little more work. Maybe how do I pass something different to this script so I can, make it work on Monday different than Tuesday with data or whatever. And then you do a little more. That person who never ever thought of themselves as a programmer, like looks back 2 years later and goes, oh my gosh, I'm a programmer. How did this happen? And they've just been like pulled into the gravity well because they never had to leave to like a grown-up language that now is harder, like C++ or C# or something, but now is more capable, right? So I say Python's a full spectrum language because that biologist can be successful, but Instagram is also built in Python. YouTube, which does 1 million requests a second, is built in Python. Like it goes all the way to the other end with a few caveats where you really can build amazing stuff. And so you don't have to leave that language, but you can start really easily there. And I think that puts it in a unique place. And much of that growth and those people coming in are coming from these like non-traditional non-CS places.
Yeah, I've tried to pick up Python a few times. I can't get past the significant white space for a long enough period of time to really get into it. But one of the drawing points that I thought was cool is what you're talking about, where you can start off basically print hello world with no structure around it at all. And then, you can build on that and learn more and more and more until you've got, Django. Is Django Python? Anyway, you've got you've got a complex application that's doing machine learning using TensorFlow or something, and doing all kinds of crazy cool stuff. And you started with this language that lets you just output something to the screen with no programming knowledge. It's that's a really cool feature of Python that I think is one of the big reasons why it kind of became the de facto college language a few years ago.
Yeah, I agree. And by the way, for the significant white space, it's totally weird. It definitely takes some getting used to. But if you have a smart editor, something that really understands it, it kind of automatically writes that for you. So that's pretty nice.
Yeah,
I think yeah, go ahead. Sorry, Clay.
Oh, I was going to say, like 10 years ago or so, even stuff like PyCharm didn't necessarily give you the best indicator that the reason why your Python wouldn't run was because you used a tab instead of a space, or vice versa.
Horrible. Yeah, but yeah, the modern editors are a lot nicer in that regard. It does take some getting used to, though. But yeah, I think there's a lot to it. What you're saying with the simplicity, I think that's why it's being adopted, and I think it took me a long time to appreciate how much people who don't see themselves as programmers don't want to go into a complex programming environment, right? Because I'm like, it's not that hard. Just compile it and run it. Like, come on. Like, sure, you got to learn the syntax, and it's like a star dash arrow double star underscore. You'll get there, right? It's fine. But I've seen over the years interviewing people, so many interesting people who are coming from other places, philosophy, race cars, somewhere that is not programming. And to them, it makes a huge difference. And once you take a step down that path, you're kind of like, oh, okay, well, we'll just stick around here till I have to leave.
And it seems these days that there's all kinds of quality content out there, specifically around Python, but other languages and technologies as well. Just looking through your YouTube channel and all of the we've got MongoDB and Python for .NET developers. Before the show started, we were talking about Blazor and WebAssembly. I mean, there's all kinds of things out there to learn how to program effectively, how to program, dare I say, properly. But
that's also a spectrum properly, right?
Yeah, getting good resources rather than here's how to hack something together. It's here's how to get started. Here's how to take baby steps. Here's how to get more complex and more powerful programs together.
I'm a big fan of like the holistic information, right? Not hunting around Stack Overflow. Like some people are happy to just like piece stuff together till it works. And I kind of want to see the whole picture and the why and the background. And you're right, there's so many things like that. YouTube is a great source. I mean, when I began in the late 90s, I guess, more or less into like professional or full-time programming type stuff, it was a book and Usenet. And if you didn't like the answer you got or you couldn't make it work from the book, too bad. Maybe you could get some sort of conversation going on Usenet, but there was not a lot of stuff. And I just really, really appreciate how much information is out there. And, I think it's interesting to look back and you think of like, not much of that information was there. The tools to build it were pretty rudimentary. It's easy to think, at least at that time, like, well, as this stuff gets easier, we'll need fewer programmers and this stuff will just have a few people like driving the tools and it'll work. And looking back, like there's so much more programming now than then. It's just like every time the tools and the information gets better, like we just go, all right, well, now we can solve bigger problems. What else can we do now instead of, build this little thing with a button? Let's build this cool API that scales to, millions of views or whatever. So yeah, super cool time to be alive.
Yeah, I took a hard detour when I got out of high school in the late 90s, and I was in my head. I love programming. I have since I was like, I don't know, 10 or something. But in my head, I was like, there's no way that a company is going to keep a developer on staff. Like they're gonna hire them, they're gonna write a program, and then they're gonna let them all go. So I need to find something that's a bit more stable, no matter, even though I love programming. So I took a hard detour, went to the military, did a bunch of other stuff, came back like 10 years later, and it's like, oh, actually, I guess they do need to keep the programmers on full time. And
there might be some sticking power to this whole thing.
Yeah, so it definitely was a different world back then. And do you remember with the books, like the examples never actually worked? You type them in and they never actually compile, and you had to,
because nobody would test them. They would just type them up and maybe they got them right and maybe they didn't. Yeah, it was, oh my goodness.
90% of those books was just troubleshooting the code that was provided for you and trying to figure out what was gone wrong, which is a good lesson, but not one you want while you're trying to learn just how to do anything at all.
You're barely grasping at straws to understand it. And they're like, to debug our problem that we couldn't catch.
Yep.
So with that, do you have a background in software development? Did you get a degree as well? Or?
What I ended up doing was, for my math degree, I had to have what's called an applied focus, and it could be like chemistry or physics or whatever. So I thought, well, this programming stuff looks pretty interesting. Let me do like a couple of CS courses, I think 2 or 3, and that's pretty much it. But I was absolutely passionate about getting good at it and learning it once I decided that I liked it more than my traditional university work. So I would just, at the time, buy book after book after book, and then later, listen to podcasts, read blogs, take online videos or watch them on YouTube or wherever they happen to be. And I would just spend like half an hour, 4 or 5 days a week on it. When I was working my lunch break, my place I would go to lunch was like 10 steps from the office. So I could go have lunch in 20 minutes, but I would, instead of just walking back to my desk and doing my work, I'd make sure I sat there for like half an hour, like, all right, I'm going to do another chapter and then I'll go back to work. And people are like, aren't you coming back to work? Like, yeah, no, I'm not going back to work. I'm supposed to have an hour. I'm going to take like at least a little bit longer and get better. And obviously it's, good for the companies as well. But I just decided I'm going to make a conscious effort to take a step forward every now and then. And surprisingly, like not a ton of people do that. And if you do it long enough, a couple of years, all of a sudden you find yourself looking around, people are asking you questions. You're like, wait a minute, I was the confused one. How'd I get here? This is weird.
Yeah, I was always the youngest developer on the team, the most inexperienced until I wasn't, and then then I became the oldest one on the team, and uh, you know, younger developers or newer to the field would come and ask me for help, and like, wait a minute, I mean, it felt like only yesterday that I was the one that was stuck on a problem, and
Exactly.
these days more often than not, it's I'm stuck on a problem and I need to just bounce it off somebody. So being that being not afraid to show other developers, especially those new to the field, that it's okay to not know what you're doing or get stuck on a problem and ask for help, because just having that conversation is going to help you figure out how to take that step back, take a beat, and figure out the problem from there.
Yeah. Well, and I think also when you're a new developer, you've got a lot of insecurities, I guess. I mean, I remember, like, I really hope they don't ask me to do anything with databases. Like, I just don't understand databases. I could do this graphic stuff and I can work with files, but if it's a database, I'm done. Like, I have no idea what this is about, right? Like, those thoughts were always like, constantly in my mind the first few years. And eventually you just realize you can't boil the ocean, especially now. I mean, there used to be 5 or 6 languages, and now it's not just the languages. I think one of the most amazing things that's happened in the last 10 years is package managers and the external libraries, right? There's a really funny T-shirt in the Python space that says, "I learned Python. It was a great weekend," or something like that, right? Because it's a simple language. What's really ironic is I've been like heads down in this for years, and I'm still every day learning Python, because what it means to learn a programming language, put Python aside, like could be C sharp, it could be JavaScript, whatever. What does it mean to learn language? Does it mean I can make for loops and functions do their magic? Yeah, but well, then there's the basic class library, standard library, which has thousands of classes. You need to understand what they do. And then all of a sudden you're like, well, but wait a minute, there's pip install or NuGet, package install or whatever, right? npm install. And now you've got hundreds of thousands of things that nobody knows all of those hundreds of thousands of things, right? Like even if they tried, you just can't consume them as fast as they go into the world. And so at some point you just like, all right, I give up. I don't know everything, and I'm just willing to say, I've never worked with TensorFlow or something like that, but I think I might need to. Does anybody know about this? Because that doesn't mean I'm a bad developer. That just means there's 100,000 things I didn't even know existed that I should be learning or shouldn't. I don't know.
Yeah, the further along I get in my programming career, the less I bother to actually learn the new things. Not that I'm not involved in them, but like there's just so much. For instance, I'm writing an application for a client right now in PHP. I don't know PHP.
it's but they wanted it, right? And you're like, all right,
right.
If you understand what we're getting into, here we go.
All of their systems are Linux, and it's being hosted on an Apache server. So I was like, okay, we'll just go with the least friction. We'll do PHP. It'll be fine.
You didn't want to say, .NET Core?
I would have loved to push that. I say Apache. It's actually GoDaddy. So .NET Core is not necessarily an option.
So it's like you get a wimpy admin panel over to it, not like a SSH.
Yeah, and it's a shared server, so I don't really. But it runs PHP, so we'll just do PHP. But like I have Googled my way and copy pasted from the docs, and like the application's coming together. It's all working. And I feel like that's all the new programming that I'm doing is kind of that way. I just accept that I don't know it and that I'm not going to know, all of it or enough of it to actually accomplish anything. So I'm just going to have to use the internet as a reference and go from there. And that's just the new way to program. And I think that, like the new people getting started today, the kids, they're, that's more or less how they're just learning to program. I need to do a thing. Oh, is there a package for it? Let me check. There is a package for it. Cool. Oh, that one's got 5.6 million downloads. I'll get that package. Everybody,
That one
it must be
probably
good.
works. Yeah.
Yeah. And then, okay, how do I do a thing? And then, Stack Overflow says, here's how you do a thing with that package. And then they've got an application. And when they tell you what the application does, like, oh yeah, it's a doorbell application. It accesses this camera. It reads, checks to see if there's a face in the camera view, and then it'll let you know that you've got a package at your door. And like, I started with C++ in the 90s, and my head goes, they did it in an afternoon because that's just the way that programming is going these days.
Right. The building blocks they're just bigger, and they accomplish more. The building blocks used to be, well, I have a data structure like a dictionary and I have a loop. Now the building blocks are, I have a thing, I call it, and it tells me what's in the picture. It's amazing.
Yeah, I have an authentication and authorization piece, and then I have a video streamer or whatever.
Yeah. I do think, though, Clayton, that it's worth just pointing out that you still applied a lot of your programming skills that you learned in C++ and C# and whatever else you're doing, right? The way to break down the problem, like, okay, it's going to need to do X, Y, and Z. That means pages like this and this, and then there's probably a database or there's an API. And those experiences are really interesting when you think about like beginners versus expert or experienced developers. It's not necessarily that you've done it before, but you've seen like, well, these are kind of the pieces I need to work with. Let me see what PHP has to offer in like a database access piece or a API piece, right?
Yeah, it's the so like, I know the core of programming. I understand programming, and I've been around the technology long enough to know that, there are these parts of an application. There are these things that the computer can do, and I can apply that when I'm looking up something. And that probably is the biggest difference between a junior and a senior right now, is just, I know programming, and it doesn't matter what language it is. It doesn't matter what system I'm accessing. I can figure it out relatively quickly. Whereas, the junior programmer may not know that that's even a thing that they can do. That doesn't necessarily stop them from asking Google if it's something they can do, which, sometimes gives them a bit of a leg up. But I think that
don't knock Google. I'm really good at Google.
I Google, but like, that's the separation anymore. The people who have been programming for a long time understand programming, and when they do run into a problem, they know how to troubleshoot it, how to debug it. And the newer person might still be struggling with that aspect. They can call a library, but if that library doesn't do what they need it to do, they might run into a problem. Whereas that's where the senior level person can be like, oh yeah, do this, never mind, try a different library, or whatever.
Yeah.
And then once you know how to do that thing, you're the go-to guy for that thing. Like, Michael, you mentioned that you don't want to be called on to do the database stuff, but you've got tons of videos out there on MongoDB and Python. So apparently at some point,
eventually I had to break down and do it. It's true. I mean, that was early days, right? Yeah. So now I'm still a fan of the NoSQL databases. I think document databases are just a thing of beauty. I so love them. About, gosh, man, I'm feeling old. Like 8 or 9 years ago, I was talking to a friend of mine, and I was lamenting pushing relational ORMs type stuff to production. I'm just like, I hate doing the migrations and the downtime, and just, he's like, well, why are you doing that? I'm like, well, because I need a database. Why are you like, he's the programmer. I'm like, what do you mean? Why am I doing this? I'm doing this. He's like, why don't you just use Mongo or something like that? I'm like, what is this? How does this work? And yeah, so I'm a big fan of those because they kind of adapt a little bit more, right? We almost never do migrations these days. Like I would say it's probably been 2 years since I've done anything that will count as a migration, maybe longer. We deploy like a couple times a week, right?
Nice.
So we do live coding streams on Wednesday evenings as well. I'm working on some personal projects, and I believe this week we're going to work on Clayton's Blazor CMS project with a MongoDB backend, and just picking that up and getting the just basic commands together is been incredible because we've been able to make pretty significant progress relatively quickly.
Mhm.
Yeah, that's super cool. Clayton, how are you talking to MongoDB? Is there like an API, a web API backend, or I'll just ask you how you talking to it.
Yeah, it is. It is a web API backend, and then the web API is using the just the core
Just the C#
Mongo
driver?
NuGet packages for it.
Yeah, yeah, that's beautiful. I mean, I do the equivalent thing in Python um, with something called Mongo Engine and some of the other things, but it's basically map classes to the database. It's beautiful.
Yep. Yeah, it's like an ORM for Mongo. I know there's without the relational part, but yeah, I'm still
Yeah.
I still structure everything. Like I've been, my brain has been relational mapping things for 20 years, so I have trouble breaking that mindset.
Yeah, the magic about the document databases, or the right mindset, I believe, is they're really, really fantastic when they're focused on serving a single application. If all sorts of different apps with different needs and different query patterns come in, all of a sudden it gets really hard to think, well, what should the structure be like? But if you're like, well, we always get this page, and when we get this, we have these other things. You're like, oh, we'll just embed that thing and the other thing, and then you just already have everything you need. The more varied the questions become, the harder the modeling becomes.
Yeah. For this particular app, it's fairly straightforward that a document database made more sense. Each data structure represents a page and the things on that page, and it can be nested down just as far as you might want to go. So it makes sense to do it that way. But if we were doing any kind of CRUD application, my head would just be like, oh, that's got to be SQL. It just has to be.
I hear you. I've had that conversation a lot. I'm super happy with the document database stuff, but it does take some getting used to, and it doesn't have a clear formula. Like, what you're going to do is, these are the basic ideas, and you do third normal form, and you create these relationships, and you got it right. There's not a clear way to know that you got it right in document databases.
You lost me at third.
That was abnormal. Yeah.
I'm with the younger version of you. I hate database stuff. I try to push that off on John as much as I can.
Yeah.
I spent my time as a database developer for many years, so there was a time I was very comfortable and still find myself in those bad habits, or at least older habits from time to time. But I'm still, these days, still very much a C# developer, and thinking in those models and figuring out how to store those. And before we started recording, we had mentioned Blazor and WebAssembly, and of course we've mentioned Clayton's Blazor CMS project. And Michael, you had mentioned maybe there's some things in the Python world that are similar or experimenting with WebAssembly, or what's the story there?
So I think there's a lot of interesting stuff, and WebAssembly is at the kernel of these interesting ideas. Like, we've been beholden to JavaScript since, I don't know, 1991 or whenever. Like, it's been a really long time, 90s, since, maybe it was later, but anyway, it's been around for a long time, and it just shocks me that it's the only way of programming a browser. Like, if I want to create a desktop app, I got a lot of options. If I want to create a web API, the problem I have is there are so many choices. Even the general, like, do I do Python or .NET? Well, once you choose that, then how many different pieces are there to decide? And the most important application, broadly, at least in terms of usage, there's one programming language, and it's okay, but it's not, it doesn't clearly live above all the others in its attributes, right? So I think WebAssembly is really interesting for a couple reasons. One, I think it's really interesting that it has this possibility to bring forward other programming models into the browser, and no one has done it better than Microsoft and the Blazor project, right? I've seen a bunch of attempts. There's some really interesting stuff happening in the Python space as well. I've talked to some of the core developers. They're like, what if we could rewrite the core of Python, which is C Python? So it's actually written in C. Uh, what if we could write that in Rust and then compile that to WebAssembly? Then all of a sudden, you might have Python in the browser, much like you have C# in the browser, right? That would be amazing. And basically anything that can be compiled to C, more or less, like without dependency on, say, I don't know, a car that is trying to drive or whatever, like it can be put into the browser, right? Like the compilers from C into WebAssembly are pretty interesting. And so I think there's a lot of interesting stuff there. There's also interesting trade-offs for one cool library in one language being automatically used through WebAssembly. So for example, in the Python space, I cannot remember what it's called. I'm sorry. People can email me and I can track it down if they really, really care. But there's a library that does the opposite of what you might think WebAssembly does. Like WebAssembly typically lets you run something in the browser, but it's a library that lets you run WebAssembly packages on your desktop or on your server, right? So if I've got, like, say, a C# Blazor, a C# WebAssembly compilation bit, some Rust stuff, and then some Python code, I could put those all together and actually work with Rust, C# and Python all in the same project using WebAssembly as the intermediary, which is also kind of an interesting potential there, right? So I don't know. I'm really excited to see what is coming from this. I think it's going to crack open some interesting stuff. My understanding is it's some of the limitations are like the interop with the DOM and the WebAssembly code is still somewhat clunky and most importantly slow because there's a lot of safeguards between, well, just straight compiled C code in your browser, right? Which I guess there probably should be, but I don't think we're there yet. But I think that there's a lot of possibilities for, languages to get along better and share cool aspects of each other using WebAssembly.
Yeah,
it's definitely. Go ahead.
I was going to say, I when Blazor was being developed while it was still in experimental mode, when it was still labeled experimental, I went and I was like, I'm curious what the competition is, where the competition is, and I found like a WebAssembly project in Rust, and I think I found one other one, but I can't remember what language. But the one in Rust was so, I mean, it like if Blazor is a newborn baby, the one in Rust was the zygote. It was like, it was just so early on that
right. Like,
like I can't believe
concept type thing.
Yeah, I can't believe how early Blazor is to the party.
When I saw Steve Sanderson give that talk, I'm just like, the landscape has changed. Like it blew my mind when I saw it. I'm like, all right, how do we convince people in the Python space from my thinking, so I don't have to write necessarily more JavaScript, or I can like do more. I'm like, how do we get that over there? There's just so many opportunities for taking your code and running it at other places and code interrupt and whatnot that, man, it's neat. And I think having a front end framework like what you're talking about it's very exciting. Honestly, it makes me jealous.
Well, to be fair, Steve Sanderson is not human. I mean,
yeah, definitely. I do have a prediction that very, very soon JavaScript as a language that you actually program in is gonna die. It's just gonna get geriatric, and then all the new stuff there will be an explosion, and maybe 5 to 10 years from now there will be an explosion of WebAssembly based conversions from existing languages, and possibly even new languages that people will be making.
So I have two thoughts for you, and I kind of agree. One, have either of you heard of this video? It's about 15 minutes, and it is one of the most informative ones on JavaScript ever, but also absolutely hilarious. It's called The Birth and Death of JavaScript.
No,
seen this?
I know.
It's by Gary Barnhart, and it's the proper pronunciation is JavaScript because it's in the future and they don't fully know how to pronounce JavaScript. And it's like it's the mapping of like from 2020 or 2018 into like 2040 of what happens in the programming languages and these weird convolutions that JavaScript goes through. There's been like a nuclear war and it's like shut down the internet for a while and people came back with it was really that doesn't sound funny, but it's actually a really, really funny story. But it's also super interesting on thinking about things like ASM.js and the foundations of like compiling stuff to the browser. So yeah, absolutely. I can certainly see that. And I'm sorry, I forgot my second one. I should have started with that, I guess. But the birth and death of JavaScript. It's really a great video. If people want to check it out, maybe I'll remember what I was going to say.
I will have to go watch that.
Yeah. He's the same guy that did the Watt video.
Yep.
About JavaScript.
Love that video.
But mostly Java. Yeah, it's hilarious. But this one is like informative and funny. What do I get if I add an object in an array? This is commutative, of course. Let me try it the other way around.
Nope.
Yeah, that was a really good one.
So what else? What's next? What are the exciting things coming down the road?
In the Python space, in the software space in general, what are you thinking?
Anything, everything.
Well, I guess I'll talk about the Python space. There's been a big friction, I guess is the right way to put it. Not quite a roadblock, but some hesitancy in that space because there's been this Python 2 versus Python 3 upgrade. They went and said, we've done some things wrong in Python 2. We're sorry. We're going to fix it in a slightly breaking way. A few things breaks, like strings, some exception handling and stuff. We're going to start over with this almost the same, but not exactly the same language. And that's actually caused a ton of challenges of people adopting some of the new ideas. For like 8 years, like Python got async and await, and people are like, I can't use that because I'm working on stuff from 2010. You're like, what? Why are you doing that, right? But finally, they've moved past that. They've retired Python 2. And in that world, we're seeing a lot of really interesting stuff come along with things like taking full advantage of async and await. There's actually some like type, almost like semi-static type stuff being applied for large scale Python stuff to make it a little more, you can track down the bugs like a compiler might, and so on. So there's a lot of interesting stuff that's being created, like a ton of new interesting web frameworks that are just going like, now we have these new ideas. What can we do with them? There are projects, I remember the second thing I was going to say about the WebAssembly, there are projects that are taking advantage of WebAssembly like PyIodide, which is something that takes the CPython runtime plus some of the C-based analysis libraries from data science like NumPy and Pandas and so on, and compiles them and runs those in the browser. So there's some interesting stuff coming along there. In general, gosh, I don't know. Clayton, you talked about some of that machine learning and C++ and like the mind exploding. I remember 20 years ago, it felt like artificial intelligence and machine learning was something that was, one, extremely rudimentary, and two, was always 30 years in the future. It's like, are we going to have fusion or meaningful AI that I can chat with first? I'm not sure. It's a toss-up, right?
Yeah.
And it was always about like, okay, well, the way we're going to know if you have proper AI is we're going to set up a chat bot and you can chat with it. If you can't tell if it's human, like it passes the Turing test, and so it's real. And then somewhere like a few years pass, and then cars are driving around on their own. And it's just like the gap between those two things is so giant that I can't believe where we have gone between there. So I don't really know what's next, but I think it's going to be really interesting to see some of those sort of, the computer will figure it out for you, change or influence software development, right? How do you step a debugger through a deep neural net? Like, I mean, you can, but it doesn't tell you how it's deciding, right? It just, well, here's some weights, and then it says it's a dog. You're like, well, if it's supposed to be a cat, how do I debug it, right? I think there's going to be some interesting mind shifts around that in general.
Just want to point out real quick, technically we did have Cold Fusion before we had useful AI.
That's true, until Adobe killed it.
Yeah. I'm pretty sure when I log into my online banking, one of the pages says redirect from Cold Fusion on it.
Oh my
so
gosh.
There's still some code out there running.
The thing that upsets me most about my online banking is there are upper bounds on the password length. It's like the password must be 8 to 12 characters. Like, wait a minute. Why can't it be 20 characters?
Because
Why does it have to be 20?
It's still being saved on an AS400 somewhere. They don't.
Exactly. But if it's a hash, the size doesn't change.
So your standard
If you care
password
about
of
the-
correct horse battery staple doesn't work?
No, I had to go for just correct battery, and now I can log in.
So we'll be sure to include all the links for everything in the show notes, but are there specific resources that you might want to point out to listeners, either directly for Python just getting started or anything that we spoke about?
Sure. So most of my resources are in the Python space. So I'll tell you those first and see if I can think of anything else. So I have my 2 podcasts, TalkPython.fm and PythonBytes.fm. And those are really interesting and easy ways to get into the ecosystem. Yeah, I'll run this really quick by you guys. When I first started the show, I thought only experts would drop in. Like, who's going to listen to like the internals of like a ORM? Like, only people who are really into this stuff, right? And I got a bunch of people who said, I'm starting to understand what you said. I've been listening for 2 months and it's starting to make sense. I'm like, well, why were you listening? This is so weird. I mean, that's awesome. Thank you. But people were using it as language immersion. Like, you want to learn Portuguese, you move to Brazil and eventually you'll know it. Right. And so I think, if people just want to kind of swim in the water, I think listening to the podcast is really great. I have a bunch of online courses at training.talkpython.fm. People can check those out. There's some beginner stuff, some advanced stuff, some web stuff, and some data science stuff, and so on. And yeah, those are the ones I got.
Perfect.
Fantastic. What has been helpful in your career that you might share with those just getting started or those looking to level up their careers?
Well, I told the story about, not giving up my lunch hour, half of my lunch hour every day back to the company, but instead using that for personal development, which also really actually helped them. So that's one. But let me give another one, since I already talked about that. I think there's a lot of things that, as somewhat introverted techie people, we might not gravitate towards. So, for example, public speaking. I don't know how you guys felt about it when I was in college. I had to take a speech class. I didn't like it. I didn't want to get up there and talk about some random thing that I wasn't inspired about. I care about programming. I'm happy to talk about that, but like random stuff. But here's the thing. What I found was, when I started doing things like presenting at meetups or submitting conference talks or those types of things, or even, agreeing to be on a podcast, it really opened up possibilities. I made tons more connections than the 3 people that I knew at work, and people who were really passionate, about whatever it was that I was talking about. And so I encourage people to do something uncomfortable and put themselves out there, right? I mean, maybe right now is a great time. There's a lot of stuff wrong with right now, but it's a great time for this because so many user groups are virtual anyway. Like, I would never suggest that I speak at a Florida, the Tampa meetup or whatever, because the cost of me getting there, which I would love to go there, but the cost of me getting there for a 1-hour speech, it often doesn't make sense, right? But now it makes a lot of sense. I can do Zoom from wherever, right?
Mhm.
And so I think there's a great opportunity for people to expand beyond just the team that they're in and really grow. And you just get so many opportunities for new jobs, new career advancement, new ideas that you exchange with people, new contacts you can get. Like, John, if you're stuck, you can say, oh, but that guy at the user group, he was doing more than me. I'm going to ask him, right? So that's my advice, is to take some steps towards that public speaking thing, even though it's probably not super comfortable for us.
Yeah, that's really good.
Thanks.
A lot of people really should follow that advice. That's a great way to, if nothing else, give back. Do you have any social media accounts that you'd like to share with our listeners?
I'm all about the Twitter. I feel like that's where a lot of tech people are. I have like a Facebook page and stuff, but for the podcast, but twitter.com/mkennedy is probably the place to go.
Great. Appreciate you, Michael. Really appreciate you taking the time to speak with us today.
Hey guys, it's been great. Really enjoyed the conversation. Thanks for having me.
That was Michael Kennedy. Michael is the founder and host of Talk Python to Me. a weekly podcast about Python and related software development topics. He's an entrepreneur, a father of 3 girls, a husband, a student, and a teacher.
If you like this episode, please like, rate, and review on iTunes.
Find show notes, blog posts, and more at sixfiguredev.com.
And catch us live each week on Twitch, and be sure to follow us on Twitter at SixFigureDev.
This has been another episode of the Six Figure Developer Podcast, helping others reach their potential. I am John Calloway.
And I'm Clayton Hunt.